our seats. Okay. Just to remind everybody, if you could either put your phones on silent, vibrate, best of all, switch them off. And we'll remind you at the end to switch them back on again. Can you hear? Okay. On behalf of Telfed, the South African Zionist Federation in Israel, Jerusalem branch, Wits, the Mizrachi Olami, the World Mizrachi Movement, and Wits University alumni here in Israel, we welcome you all here this evening. And it's a great honor and privilege to have you all here this evening. Albert Einstein once said, if I was not a physicist, I would probably have been a musician. I often think in music, I live my daydreams in music, and I see my life in terms of music. Well, tonight, we are all in for a very special musical treat. I'd like to introduce Roy Sher, a very close and dear friend of mine. I want to thank Roy and all those who made tonight's event a reality. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us from near and far. Parashat Shoftim, we read, Tamim tiyeh im Hashem Elokecha. Go humbly with God Almighty. Richard, as a qualified accountant, understands numbers very well. And as an excellent cook, he knows recipes even better. So therefore, Richard figured out, sorry the pun, a great recipe by how to live his life, in line with the pasuk that I quoted. To be more involved, doing chesed as he does, to make this world a better place, therefore making people happier, and he therefore has less time to think about his own amazing achievements. The conclusion is, he's a humble gentleman. I want to thank firstly Mizrachi Olami, World Mizrachi, for hosting the evening this evening. Unfortunately, Rav Doron Peretz, the CEO of World Mizrachi, couldn't join us. Please send his regards. And also to his PA, Maxine, who did all the background work to organize this evening. Thanks to Les, my dear friend, representative of Wits alumni, for helping me and always being a great asset to all the functions we put together. As Les said, I'll remind you again, please put your phones on silent, especially that it's a music evening and not to destroy anything. Even though Richard would not want me to mention his talents, a long list of them, most importantly, which for tonight, he's the founder and director of the Ramatayim Men's Choir, which we are privileged to have approximately 5-6 of the members here, as well as their professional pianist, Aviva. In addition to that, Richard is also a composer, a poet, a mountain climber, marathon runner, a great photographer, and he spoils us with his wonderful pictures when he sends us after his incredible trips overseas, which we all love, and as mentioned before, a great cook. But to top it all, Richard is a thorough gentleman and a mensch. Richard, my dear friend, please come and present your presentation.
Good evening, everybody. After that, I think I'd rather go home right now. Yes, so first of all, thank you all very much for being here this evening. Special thanks to 3 groups of which I feel close to. One of them, Telfed. Thank you very much for inviting me here this evening. As a South African Ole, we all have connections with Telfed. Mizrachi, also close to my heart. I was a B'nai Akiva boy in South Africa since the age of 13. And the Wits Alumni Organization, surprisingly enough, and you'll find out why in a minute, I am an alumnus of Wits University. So thank you very much to all of you, to Roy and to Les, whose chesed works are both known and lesser known. Kol hakavod to you gentlemen for organizing this evening. And last and most, to my dear wife Cheryl sitting over there, who without whom the stuff that I do could be possible. Can you all hear me?
No, this is just playing it up.
What?
too loud. Too low.
Hello? Okay. Right, so as this is kind of a schmooze tonight about music and history, I thought that I would give you, present my... Can you hear, is it going on up and down?
It's the wires on.
One. I'm going to try without the microphone and you tell me if you can hear me. So I thought that I would present you my credentials given the fact that this is a history and a music schmooze. In terms of music, I have yet to take a formal music lesson. It's something that I'm planning on doing in my retirement. Please God, we should all be healthy. But in terms of history, I studied history at school. I've got a couple of schoolmates here who will remember fondly Ronnie Bink, our history teacher. And I'm proud to say that of all my matric exams, my history mark was the top mark that I got at school. And just to prove that, these are the results of my matric exams in 1972. And I proudly present my history mark. It's the top mark and it's a C. It sits there, I don't know if you can see, but it sits along with the D's and E's. And full disclosure, the E that appears there for Hebrew is actually after a remark. I think they felt sorry for me because the original mark was an F. And and that is why it's surprising that in the end I am actually a Wits alumnus. But on the other hand, since the age of 10 years old, I've been singing in shul choir, starting off with the garden shul, that magnificent shul in the gardens in Cape Town, where I started off as a pick soprano in the choir. And since then, I've been either singing or involved with choirs ever since. And almost instantly, I fell in love with this genre of music. A passion which has developed over the years, and hence the subject of tonight's talk, which is the origins and development of shul music in South Africa. So first of all, let's establish what is South African Jewry. Now, I'd like you please to raise your hands, those of you, I'm pretty sure that you all have this information, those of you whose ancestors arrived in South Africa, say between 1890 and 1925. Raise your hands, please. Okay, so we have 90% of the audience here raising their hands. The other 10% happen to be friends of mine from France, from England, from America, from Canada, and one Dane. There's one of my friends here is from Copenhagen that's here this evening. They're the ones that did not raise their hands. 90% of South African Jewry emanates from people who came to the country in between 1890 and 1920. Where did they come from? Okay, I would like you once again to raise your hands. Those people who emanate from Lita. Now, before you raise your hands, let me just explain what I mean by Lita. We're not talking about just the Republic of Lithuania that we know today. Rather, the area that consisted the Duchy of Lithuania, which reached its zenith of power and land in around about the 15th century. And that includes Lithuania, and you'll have a look at the map here, parts of Latvia, the northeastern section of Poland, most of the Ukraine, and large swathes of Belarus. Okay, who has ancestry from that area? It is not for naught that the nickname a Litvak community stands its ground. The South African community almost exclusively comes from Lita and arrived between 1890 and 1925. What was the mode of shul tefillah, shul prayer, the music in the shuls and the shtibbles of Lita in the 1890s? It consisted of generally a bal tefillah or a chazan, singing the ancient modes that were brought down from generation to generation, from teacher to student, from father to son, most of which we all know here. For example, Musaf and Shacharit on Shabbat morning, Chazarat Hashatz, after the Kedusha, we sing in what is called a Freigish Steiger, a Freigish mode, and goes something like this. The basic line is, Tikanta Shabbat Ratzita Korbonoteha, Tzivita Perusheha, Im Sidurei Nesacheha. The Freigish mode. The Chazan possibly would do some kind of ornamentation on that. This ornamentation would be pretty primitive. It would be pretty much ad hoc, certainly not in any ordered fashion, and pretty spontaneous. For example, Tikanta Shabbat Ratzita Korbonoteha Tzivita Perusheha Im Sidurei Nesacheha V'chulei v'chulei. And if he had any vocal accompaniment around him, maximum he would have 1 or 2 or 3 men standing next to him who would be singing what we call responses. They would sing Korbonoteha, Tzivita Perusheha, Im Sidurei Nesacheha, Nesacheha. And that was the music of the Lithuanian shuls, the Eastern European shuls in the late 19th century. It was in fact the dawning of the great age of Chazanut. Names like Yossele Rosenblatt, Kusevitsky, Sirota, Hirschman, and many others were all born in the Ukraine and thereabouts, but they were just starting their careers, and they would gain fame both in Europe and in North America, but well after the Jews had left Lithuania for South Africa. So is that what we heard in our South African shuls when we were growing up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s? No. Many of you know that the Chinese are spreading their influence in Africa. Great infrastructure projects are being financed, designed, and built by Chinese companies in order to increase the economic welfare of many of the countries on the continent. They're spreading their political clout as well. But not only in the economic and political fields are they spreading their influence, there's also great cultural exchange amongst many of the African countries and China. And so it is that approximately 10 years ago, there was an exchange between the music department of the University of Cape Town and the Central Conservatory of Music in Beijing, where doctoral students were coming from China to UCT. And it so happened that they were staying in a hotel on Main Road Seapoint. Many of you have been there. And it was a Saturday morning. They weren't studying or working that morning, and they decided to walk on the beachfront. And they're walking down to the beachfront, down Marais Road. And as they walk, they see this like kind of public-looking building with a star on it. And they hear music emanating from this building. Now they're in deep south, the tip of Africa. They would expect to hear some kind of African rhythms or some kind of contemporary pop or rock music, which spreads around with the internet and everything else. So they go a little bit closer. They're interested in music in general, and they are blown away because what they're hearing, and one of the students specifically was studying this particular genre of music. They're hearing songs. They're hearing music. That this particular songs that they're hearing they don't recognize, but it's the genre of Western European sacred and secular music of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And they have no idea where this comes from. And together with that, there's certain inflections of American folk music of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Completely out of the ballpark. The kind of music that they were hearing, one of the pieces that they heard was this. Who doesn't? Right, okay. That song, that piece is the cog of the answer to the conundrum. That piece of music was composed by one Solomon Zulzer. Solomon Zulzer was born in 1804 in a little town called Hohenheim in Austria, not far from Vienna. And Hohenheim's shul services, the shul that he would have had his bar mitzvah in 1817, would sound very much like the Lithuanian shuls that are described at the end of the 19th century. Very similar. Lack of decorum, Chazan doing these improvisations in a very haphazard way, etc., with the ancient modes. But he lived in a very, very special time in history in a specific place. Hohenheim, his family had been in Hohenheim since the 1600s. Twice they had been banished to other towns by a local decree. And the name Zulzer actually comes from the fact they were originally Levi. They were Levi'im. And their family's name was Levi, but at one stage there was a decree that all of the Jews had to take on a Germanic name. They had fled once to a town called Zulz, hence the name Zulzer. And they were living secluded in the Jewish section of this town because the Jews were only allowed to live there. And they were only allowed to practice certain professions. But it's 1804, and it's not long after 1789. In 1789, come on, certainly the guys from my class, what happened in 1789? The French Revolution. The French Revolution with its banner, with its slogan of liberty, equality, fraternity, and that included everyone, and that included the Jews. In 1791 in France, there's a proclamation, emancipation for the Jews. The Jews are free to do just as everybody else, and all the serfs and everybody else is free to live where they want, to practice any profession that they want. And that slogan was carried on Napoleon Bonaparte's flag as he swept through Europe, conquering city after city, land after land. And he took with him that mantra and he put it into practice. It's a big debate as to whether Napoleon himself was a philo-Semite or an anti-Semite. Rabbi Beryl Wine, in his book relating to the subject, reckons that Napoleon's hidden agenda was to free and assimilate the Jews to the extent that they would disappear altogether and become part of the fabric of French and European society. We all know what happened to that. But Napoleon, for example, he convened what we called a council of notables, asking them some very interesting questions, asking them 12 questions to which he wanted to know the Jewish response to. Two of them, for example, were, in the eyes of the Jews, are Frenchmen not of the Jewish religion considered as brethren or as strangers? What conduct does Jewish law prescribe towards Frenchmen not of the Jewish religion? The answers that this council of notables provided him were totally favorable to his agenda. And then he convened what he called the Great Sanhedrin. He brought the great rabbis of the time in France to give their gushpanka to all of these conclusions that the notables had made, which they in fact did. And there was this symbiosis between Napoleon's line of thought and the Jewish people, and one after another, the cities, the towns, the countries of Europe, Western Europe, were emancipated. So we have, for example, in 1808, the Grand Duchy of Hesse. In 1812, Prussia. In 1811, the Great Frankfurt. All of them declared emancipation for the Jewish people. And as the Jewish people felt free to roam around, they started coming to the cities. And in the cities, they were, they were amazed. They were saying it was like, it reminds me of like when the Ethiopians came to Jerusalem. It was like coming to, you know, the ultimate situation. They came to the cities, and one of the things that they were amazed about on a Sunday, out of curiosity, they would go and check the local church, walk into a church, see a magnificent edifice, and more than that, see the order of the service and the beautiful choral music of the service. And they found a certain spirituality in this, and they decided that they would like to emulate this kind of way of worship. When Sulzer came to Vienna, in 1820, there were less than 1,000 Jews living in Vienna, with no shuls at all. By the year 1900, there were 147,000 Jews living in Vienna, comprising approximately 10% of the total population. And as we all know, many, many Jews contributed to the culture, to the art, to the science, to medicine, not just to Vienna, not just to Austria, but they contributed to humanity. I have a few statistics here, and I'd like you folks to throw out a couple of guesses. In 1930, given the fact, remember that the Jews consisted 10% of the population of Vienna. 1930, how many of Vienna's doctors, what percentage of Vienna's doctors were Jewish?
65.
What's that?
65.
65. Okay, it was 51%. How many of the lawyers were Jews?
60.
85%. How many of the pub owners in Vienna in 1934 were Jewish? 2. What's that? 4%. Okay. How many of the scrap metal dealers in Vienna in 1934 what percentage were Jewish? 4%. 100%. Now what I reckon is that there was just one scrap dealer, I think. They came into the cities, and the first shul was called the Stadtplatz shul in
Temple.
There was actually an Orthodox shul, believe it or not. Okay, this shul was designed by the same designer who designed for Joseph, Prince of Liechtenstein, his palaces and his garden pavilions and his theaters. No coincidence that they took that kind of architect to build the shuls. This shul actually exists to today. It was saved from Kristallnacht and the Holocaust by the fact that it's built into a residential area. You can't even see the facade of the shul, and it survived. Just to give an example of how the shuls imitated the churches, here's a local Vienna church. You will notice the tall arched, tall domed ceilings, the arches, the central aisle heading towards a focal point in the front and center. Here is the Leopoldstrasse temple, built in 1858. And look at the similarities. The tall arch ceilings, the domes, the central point in the middle, and look how the folks there are dressed. And just as the Jews imitated the architecture, the Jews also wanted to imitate the music. When the Stadt's temple were thinking about, the Gabaim got together and were thinking about who should we appoint as the first chazan, music director, musical arranger of our synagogue, it was an easy choice. Sulzer at the time was 22 years old. He had a commanding presence. He was a wonderfully charismatic personality. He had a magnificent, dynamic, strong voice. He was a genius musically, and more than anything, he had a burning passion and desire to create a body of music that would be true on the one hand to those ancient steigers that the Jews had been singing for centuries, but to put them in order, and to create a choral, a choir-centered tefillah. Over the 50-odd years, Sulzer reigned supreme in Vienna, composing hundreds, if not thousands, of compositions, Tzion as an example, which encompassed the entire realm of tefillah, from Modeh Ani Lefanecha in the morning, during the week, to Shema Yisrael in the Ilah at the end of Yom Kippur. And just to give you an example of the breadth of his work, By the way, this is Napoleon's Sanhedrin meeting to discuss those principles that we talked about before. But just to give you an idea of his music, this is one page, one tiny page of contents amongst hundreds. You probably can't see it that well from here. Roy, can we focus this maybe a little bit more? Do you know that? Okay.
There's a zoom on the top.
Okay, but there are pieces here. For example, the middle line is each a separate composition for each line of tal. The tfilat tal each line has got its own composition. Shloshes Re Midot takes up about 5 or 6 different compositions. Hoshana Rabbah has one of the things that I saw in one of his books. He has notation for how the caller of the shofar blasts, notated how he calls tkiya, shvarim, tru'ah, etc. Incredible depth, incredible thought, and absolute order. And Zortzer is followed. He was the main protagonist. He was the founder of this movement. But he's followed by tens, if not hundreds, of chazanim who populate the shuls as they develop through Europe. But there were three or four main protagonists, the stars of this movement. Amongst them were Louis Lewandowski, who operated from Berlin. He was there for 50 odd years in Berlin.
What year?
What's that?
What years?
What year is Louis Lewandowski? Louis Lewandowski was born in 1821. He came as, I think, a 13-year-old to Berlin. We're digressing here, but just quickly. Came as a 13-year-old to Berlin. He was the first Jew to be allowed to study in the Academy of Music in Berlin. And from around about the age of 20 till very close to when he passed away in, I think, 1894, he was the choir master of shuls in Berlin. And here is a photograph. This is the facade of the Oranienstrasse synagogue in Berlin. The interior was completely destroyed through the Second World War. This shul was built to house Lewandowski's choir.
Wow.
And organ. And it held 3,000 people without microphones, without any kind of hagbara. The acoustic management and architecture in those days was absolutely incredible. 3,000 people would come here to listen to Lewandowski and his choir. Lewandowski, by the way, was the first one that wasn't actually a chazan. He was specifically a choir master and dealt only with the choir. Whereas Zulzer was a chazan. One of the stars was Naumburg, who was in Paris. Also around about the same time. He was about perhaps 30 years in Paris. And another one of the greats was Julius Mombach. Mombach, who was born in Germany, went with his father, again as a youngster, to London, and for approximately 50 years was a choir master and composer. For example, one of Mombach's tunes, which you will recognize as well. Okay, we'll get to it. We'll get to it somewhere along the way again. Okay, one of them was Hodor al Eretz. That could be I'm not used to the screen. No, that's a picture here. Okay, that's Mombach. We have pictures here of, this is Naumburg. That was Naumburg. He looks pretty Parisian. And this is Louis Lewandowski. And Louis Lewandowski, together with the others, were taking the inspiration from, as I said, the music that they were hearing in the churches. Here we're going to listen to a snippet of Bach's St. Matthew's Passion. Listen up. Okay. Here we have Louis Lewandowski's Zacharti Lach. And you might recognize the pianist sitting in. Feel free to sing along, folks. Okay. Now let's look. Let's look at the. Yeah. Let's look at the notation of the St. Matthew's Passion and Zacharti Lach. It's a little bit. Can you see the colors on the screen? On the notes. The top line is the notation of the first phrase of St. Matthew's Passion. Da, 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 da. And Zacharti Lach. Da, 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 da. It's not a crib, but it is a profound influence. Okay, here we have, again, this time Handel's Hallelujah. Okay, and here we have Louis Lewandowski's Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Not only is it the same kind of feel to it, but even if you think of the line of this line in Louis Lewandowski, hum, bum, 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 and Handel's Hallelujah, da, 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 dum, bum. It's not a crib, but it's a profound influence. Meantime, what was happening in the East? We spoke about Vienna spreading to Berlin, to Paris, to London, across Western Europe. Why wasn't it spreading to Eastern Europe? There was a double-edged reason that this music did not reach Lithuania, Litva, Russia, and the East in the late 19th century. Poles apart, the two reasons, but nevertheless, in a tacit way, they worked together. There was the Tsar, who imposed incredible restrictions on life of Eastern European Jewry, where they could live, what they could do. The Jews were in general mired in poverty. Hands up, those of you who put your hands up before, whose great-grandparents came to South Africa from Lithuania with 1 million rubles in their pockets? No hands. Okay, I'm sure you've all got stories like I have of my great-grandparents and my grandparents. And I thank them very, very often whenever I think about where we are today, because they came with nothing. And on the other hand, there was the Rabbanim, whether it was the Hasidim or the Mitnagdim. The Rabbanim led the communities, and their interest was to keep to tradition. It's no surprise that when we sing tradition, tradition, it's about the shtetl in Eastern Europe, right? It's not about Vienna and London. Those two elements conspired to keeping the Jews in the mode that they'd been for centuries and centuries. So we have the East, where no movement was taking place musically, and we have the West, where all of this new stuff was happening. What was happening in South Africa? 1652, Jan van Riebeeck comes, and for 150 years, the Dutch, by the way, before him was, of course, the Hottentots, and we shouldn't forget that. And the Bushmen, the Hottentots have got a new name now, Khoi, I think, something like that. Whatever. Okay, comes Jan van Riebeeck, they establish a way station, a provision center for ships traveling east and west, Europe to India and back. For 150 years they're there. We're not going to get involved in all of the history. But in 1806, finally, in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, the British Empire was starting to establish itself. The Brits wanted the provision station at the tip of Africa, that massive strategic point on the map of the world at that time. And in 1806, in the decisive, and Dobby Shock had asked me this Battle of Blauberg thing, did you make it up? Okay, no. In 1806, in the Battle of Blauberg, it was both a naval battle, and we have a wonderful photograph here of that's a Thomas Baines. Many of you will recognize this kind of the style of painting. These are the British ships about to engage with the Dutch and the French ships just off the Cape in a naval and a land battle. Not a massive battle, not a massive war. There were 5,000 British troops ranged approximately against approximately 3,000 Dutch, French, and local militias. The Brits beat the other guys, and in 1806, 2 years after Zulza was born, under this tree, a rather unremarkable tree, except that for the fact that that tree in Woodstock, Cape Town, underneath that tree was signed the Treaty of Woodstock, handing over power of the Cape to the British. Okay, the British have got the Cape, they're establishing the colony, they're establishing the empire. They need people to come down there. Compound that with the fact that, like in many, many wars, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Waterloo takes place in 1815, the end of Napoleon, hundreds of thousands of survivors of the soldiers come back to Britain and all come home, and they've got nothing to do. Massive unemployment, what do we do with these people? And so, for that reason, and in order to establish the colony, they invite people to immigrate from Britain to the Cape. 90,000 people apply. There are 4,000 lucky people who get accepted to go down to the Cape. And in 1820, the 1820 settlers, they come down to the Cape and establish communities from Port Elizabeth down to Cape Town. And amongst them are a sprinkling of Jews. Amongst those, that sprinkling are 5 brothers, the 5 Northern brothers. They're in their 20s and they're coming to seek their fortune. One of them actually was killed in an act of bravery in the Battle of the Axe against the Xhosas in 1847. But now we are again diverting. One of the other brothers, Benjamin Norden, he first arrives and he tries his hand in farming. Doesn't go too well. He then goes to Grahamstown and spends a few years there, and eventually finds himself in Cape Town living in a place called Helmsley House, which is now where the Mount Nelson Hotel is in Cape Town. And the years go by, the decades go by, but he still has his Yiddish heart, and he just wants to get together with the Chevra and have a tefillah. There's not been one tefillah probably in sub-Saharan Africa like ever. In 1841, he sends out a WhatsApp to his brethren, and on Leil Yom Kippur, 1841, we're talking about 176 and 1 month ago, the first organized minyan takes place in sub-Saharan Africa. 17 men arrive and they have a tefillah. In 1848, the first shul is established in the Garden Shul, the precursor of the modern Garden Shul. And over between 1840 and 1880, approximately 4,000 to 5,000 British Jews arrive in the Cape. And they start, even though it's a small number, they start to establish shuls all over. all along that seaboard. And those shuls are developed, established and developed in the spirit, in the image of what their mother shuls in England, and a few sprinkling of Yekim as well. Order, systemized, and perfectly run like clockwork. And it is 1880, and there are 4,000 Jews, and they have established the shuls. And suddenly, the Oosten-Juden start flocking into the Cape and into southern Africa. And they arrive to tefillot that they have no connection with. But two things conspire against them making a change. One, the Brits have a sense of empowerment and superiority. They are part of the great British Empire, and nobody is going to mess with our shuls. If you want your own shul, you can make your own shul. Very, very few do that, for good reason. There was the Ponevezher shul, which today is still this beautiful little shul in the heart of Cape Town. But most of them join those British shuls because they come with nothing. They don't have a million rubles. They need to put the bread on the table. They can't start running the shuls and dictating their Jewish way of life there. So they enter into that system, and they get enveloped in that system, and they start to even love the system. And so it was that despite the fact that in 1920 there are now 40,000 Jews in South Africa, of whom 36,000 are Litvaks, they're doubling like the Brits. Okay, there is another reason, to my mind, this is my own home-baked idea, why that system continued to take place. Choirs were popping up all over the place. In Cape Town, for example, when I was growing up, not a big, huge Jewish community. There were choirs in the Camp Space Shul, the Garden Shul, the Friedrich School, the Shul, the Schooner Street Shul, the Milnerton Shul, the Claremont Shul, and you probably know of a couple of others as well. Mr. Friedgott, who I just met just earlier on, he was in East London, and there was a choir in East London. Okay. The other reason is, to my mind, the following. Most of our forefathers and mothers who came to South Africa from later came as Dati, learned, pious people. But within a generation or two, most of our parents were not Dati at all. Yet, they stayed within the fold of, they were members of an Orthodox congregation. They drove to shul, they came home, they made kiddush, and then they went to soccer, and they went to work on Shabbat morning. Most of them. So how do you keep those people in shul? They're not really coming to daven. They're coming for the social thing. The girls are checking out the guys are checking out the girls, and they come to hear the beautiful service. Just to illustrate this point of this great generational gap between the originals and those that came afterwards, I'm going to show you a little clip. It's a personal clip. By the way, before I started showing this clip, and I've given this talk once or twice before, I asked my local rabbi, Rabbi Slotky, if I can show a clip, for example. When I put it a clip, it was an 8mm 4-minute reel in those days, that was taken on Shabbat or a Chag. And his answer was, if it's for educational purposes, then you can show it. I would also say there's a certain statute of limitations. This was taken in 1954. But forget that. Now, whether you call this education or not, that you can decide. But here is a clip. And I want you to look at this closely, and I want you to tell me how you think it describes that generation gap. The subject is my late great-grandfather, Ephraim Bloch. The photographer is my late father, Albert Sabitson, Zichrono Bracha, and here it is.
Wow.
Leila Seder in 1954. Happened to be a Saturday night, as I checked out and as you're about to find out. Any ideas? What's that?
Kiddush and Havdalah.
Kiddush and Havdalah.
We made Kiddush and Havdalah together. We know that, and as I said, I checked it out. Leila said in 1954 was Saturday night. Okay, but what in that clip describes the generation gap? Any ideas? Well, I'll give you two.
He's not using a text.
Jules, absolutely spot on.
What was that?
Okay. How many of us here who lead Leilot Seder will do the Kiddush of the first night of Pesach, Leila Seder, including the Havdalah, without a Haggadah? He had it all in his head. He was a pious Jew. Now, my father, who was an incredible, wonderful human being. Now, he thought when you mentioned Gomorrah, he thought there was like a neighbor to storm. Okay, there was like, we're talking about like this pious Jew and my father. He did not have a text in his hands. There's another thing. The expression on his face, was my late great-grandfather happy? No, he was scowling. He was really, as we say, knocked at my father for taking a movie on Leila Seder. What is this? Okay, that to me describes this generation gap. Through the years, as the Oosternjuden became established, as our parents' generation, they started going to university and getting professions and making a living, there was a certain swing towards the Chazanut aspect as opposed to the choral aspect. Great Chazanim came into South Africa, Kusavitsky and Berla Chagi and Moshe Stern and Heinowitz and Malovani and Bagley, etc., etc., etc. They all came, but they came and they collaborated with these choirs. And if we spoke about Sulzer, Mombach, Naumburg, and Lewandowski, there was a certain South African equivalent whose music echoed that kind of synthesis. And his name was Himmelstein, okay, who taught Mr. Fee got his wrong bar mitzvah because it was in the wrong Shabbat, but that's another story. Okay. A.M. Himmelstein grew up in Warsaw, and in the 1930s he was already conducting choirs. He came as a young man to Cape Town. He was in the Roland Street Shul. That was his first job as a choir master. He was in Cape Town for a number of years. He went up later in his life to Johannesburg, the Walmer Shul, and he started the Oval Shul as well. And he started to compose music relatively late in his life. But he composed the most beautiful tunes. And here is one of them, where you will hopefully see the synthesis between the choir on the one hand. You'll hear the choir dominant at the beginning, and then the chazan doing his thing. This is an A.M. Himmelstein song, which is sung to this day in Australia, South Africa, America, and here in Israel. The chazan is Simon Cohen. Comes from the choir. He's leading.
Oh
The synthesis between the choir and the chazal.
Where is this?
Excuse me?
Where was that taken?
That was in Girard Bachar, just around the corner from here, a couple of years ago. I was in the Berea Shul Choir in Johannesburg in 1978, 1979. On certain Sundays through the year, we would be singing in the choir 5 to 6 weddings on a single Sunday. The Sunday before, the first Sunday of December, which was the start of the school holidays. The Sunday before and after the Sphira. 5, 6 weddings in a row, one after the other, singing the same stuff. I'll never forget the one time, the poor Rabbi Eloi, he had a tough time. I'll never forget the time that he's standing under the chuppah there and he's blessing the chatan and the kala, and he says, I remember your late great-grandfather. He was such a great gabbai of the shul. I remember him well, Mr. Cohen. He did so much for the shul. And the shamus says to him, this is the Levy wedding, not the Cohen. It's a tough job. The choir, we would sing one after the other. When the bride came in, what was it? Baruch haba, composed by Mombach. Then we would sing as the kala walked around the chatan. We would sing Miadir. Who composed that Miadir? Zulzer. After that, before the Sheva Brachot, we would sing Hallelujah of Lewandowski, which we heard before. And finally, after the Sheva Brachot, we would do this number, which was Naumburg. Sing along with. Would sing in the shuls in South Africa at the end of the weddings, and into this mishmash, we have to factor in another seminal, historic event that affects the Jewish community in South Africa, like communities all over the world. 1967, it's the 6-Day War. There's a massive resurgence of Jewish spirituality, Jewish meaning, Jewish religiosity. I myself, I'm a product of that, and some of the Hebrew here are products of that phenomenon. We came from the houses where our parents took videos on Shabbat and drove to shul and etc. etc. But wow, this is just something, we're kids. But there's Bnei Akiva. Let's join Bnei Akiva. The Hebrews, it became like this cool thing. Bnei Akiva suddenly becomes a serious movement. Learning begins to take shape in the country. And suddenly young people, especially young people, when they go to shul, they actually want to go to shul to daven as opposed to listen to the choir. And so there's this, I remember the massive debates around whether we can break away minyanim and not be part of the main shul, the fights with the gabaim, and etc., etc. I remember Waverley Shul, the big issue was we, as an act of protest, because they wouldn't let us have our own minyan, we came to shul without ties. I mean, that was massive rebellion. And we were called in by the chairman, the president, and ex officios, or whatever they're called. And, right, whatever. But it starts happening. And people want a different kind of music. They don't want to reject it completely. At the Bnei Akiva Shul, we were still singing Ki Tzion and Hodo Al Eretz, etc. But we wanted something that we could sing, not to be sung to, but to sing with. And into that picture comes Shlomo Carlebach and all of the other Hasidic and neo-Hasidic masters of the nigun, of the light song, of the song that was inspirational to people who were actually singing as opposed to listening. Shlomo Carlebach actually had three things in common with Lewandowski, believe it or not. Number one, they were both from Berlin. Shlomo Carlebach was born in Berlin. Lewandowski operated since he was 13 years old, he was in Berlin. They both had a passion for Jewish music, and they both had a massive desire to mold the music into what they thought would add to the spirituality of the Jewish religious experience. And that we all know and sing Carlebach melodies. Carlebach, thank God, his family left Berlin in the 1930s. They actually first went east. I think he was in Lithuania, actually. He learned in yeshivot there. And then they came to America. And in America, in the 1960s, he was hanging out both in New York and in San Francisco. And he would be meeting with guys like Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan. Here we have a photograph which we think, I don't know if you can really see it, but okay, we think it was taken at the 1966 Berkeley Song Festival. The guy with the harmonicas, obviously, that's Bob Dylan, and the guy with the kippah is Shlomo Carlebach, and they're having a schmooze there. And I just have this picture in my head. It's Greenwich Village, and Carlebach and Bob Dylan are schmoozing over a cup of coffee or a beer or whatever. And Bob Dylan says to Shlomo Carlebach, Rebbe, what do you think of our new number? It's about to be released. Take a listen. And this is where you do something. Okay. This is the number that he started jamming with Shlomo Carlebach. So what do you think, Reb? What do you think of my new number? And he says, oh, that is a heilige nigun. That is a heilige nigun. And they end their meeting, and Shlomo Carlebach's going home, and he's humming this thing to himself. How many times must the cannibals fall before they're forever bound? Da 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 da. And it takes him a little while to get home, and by the time he gets home, it's kind of morphed a little. Da 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 da. Bimkom chamalkeinu tofia. Now it's not a crib, but it's a profound influence. And so it is that American rock, American folk, and soft rock and pop color music got infused into that whole equation down there in Sipho and Shul. And so we have it. So ladies and gentlemen, the next time that you are confronted by a Chinese musicologist who demands to know what is the reason for that kind of music at the southern tip of Africa, I hope that I've given you the answer. Thank you very much for listening.
this was the most fascinating talk, presentation, professional. He talks with love and passion with what he's doing. We're all inspired. I want to thank Richard with a small token of thanks from everybody here and from Telfed.
Thank you so much.
Will you enjoy it?
Thank you very much.
So, we'll end the evening. If anybody wants, if anybody wants to daven Mari, if you can organize a minyan at the back, you're welcome to do that. Our next function, I just want to fill you guys in what it is. It's coming up on the 21st of November. Something really interesting. This is the grandson of the King of Swaziland. An incredible story. Welcome everybody to come to this function in the same place right over here, 21st of November, and tell friends and family to join us. That basically wraps up our evening. Thanks for joining us, and see you at the next function. God bless and drive home safely.
You got it. Got it.
Jump to the front.
That
was terrific. I got Willie's